A gentle flowing begins, ancient and eternal, carrying you downstream, through mist-veiled mornings and centuries of quiet witness. Asterisk, the water remembers everything. It remembers when there were no bridges, no cities, no names for the valleys it carved from living stone. It remembers the first footsteps along its banks, the first vessels that dared its currents, the first voices that called it sacred. Tonight, as darkness settles over the hills and moorlands of England, the rivers flow as they have always flowed, whispering secrets to those who know how to listen. Let yourself drift now, downstream through time and memory, where the waters run deep and the stories run deeper still. The Thames begins its journey, not with grandeur, but with humility, rising from a spring in the Cotswold Hills where limestone meets sky. Here, in a meadow that has known 10,000 summers, the first drops emerge from the earth, cool and clear, gathering in a hollow no wider than a cupped hand. The locals have marked this place for centuries, though the markings change with the ages. Once there stood a marker stone carved with symbols older than writing. Later, a simple wooden sign. Now a weathered plaque that few pilgrims seek anymore. But the water cares nothing for recognition. It flows because flowing is its nature, seeking always the path of least resistance, the ancient call of gravity and geology. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. In those first yards, the Thames is hardly worthy of its name. It trickles between stones, parts around tufts of grass, disappears briefly underground only to resurface a few feet downstream, as if testing its commitment to the journey ahead. Cattle stand in its infant course on summer afternoons, their hooves churning the stream into temporary cloudiness. By morning, the water has cleared itself again, patient and persistent. This is how rivers begin, not with drama, but with quiet insistence, drop after drop, moment after moment, until the accumulation becomes unstoppable. The river flows eastward, though it meanders considerably in its youth, exploring side channels that lead nowhere, pooling in hollows, spreading across flood meadows when the rains are generous. Through Cricklade, the first town to claim its banks, where Saxon settlers built their homes above the water line and learned the river-s moods through hard seasons of flood and drought. The church tower here has watched the Thames for 800 years, its bells ringing out across water meadows, where herons stand like gray sentinels, waiting for the flicker of silver scales beneath the surface. As the river gains confidence and volume, it flows through Oxford, where the minds of empires have been shaped in stone colleges that back onto its banks. Here the Thames becomes broader, more purposeful, though still willing to divide around islands and rejoin itself in its own time. Students have punted along these reaches for generations, their poles pushing against the same muddy bottom that felt Roman sandals, Viking boots, medieval pilgrim staffs. The water carries their reflections briefly, then lets them go, moving on toward its appointment with the sea. But before we follow the Thames to its conclusion, let us turn our attention to the River Severn, longest of all British rivers, which rises in the mountains of Wales and carves a great arc through the border country. On the slopes of Plinlimmon, where the wind comes straight from the Atlantic, the infant Severn emerges from peat and moss, a trickle that seems impossibly fragile to become Britain's mightiest waterway. The mountain here is lonely and beautiful, wrapped in cloud more days than not, its summit visible only to those willing to climb through mist and rain. The Severn drops rapidly from its source, tumbling over rocks, gathering tributaries, cutting deeper into the landscape with every mile. Through the narrow valleys of mid-Wales it flows, past villages that cling to the hillsides, their stone cottages weathered to the same gray as the mountain stone from which they were built. The river here is young and energetic, full of rapids and pools, its water tea-colored from the peat it has washed across, its voice a constant rushing that fills the valleys day and night. At Welshpool the Severn begins to calm, spreading into a broader valley where cattle graze, and the river slows enough to reflect the sky. Here it becomes navigable, though barely, and here begins its transformation from mountain stream to working waterway. Through Shrewsbury it winds, looping around the ancient town in a great horseshoe, the castle perched on the high ground, watching for invaders who might approach along the river valley. The loop is so complete that Shrewsbury is almost an island, connected to the surrounding land by only a narrow neck of earth. Defenders appreciated this geography. The river was both moat and barrier, though enemies also knew the river's ways and sometimes used it to their advantage. Below Shrewsbury, the Severn enters a different landscape entirely. The hills fall away, the valley broadens, and the river takes on the character it will maintain until the sea. Broad and brown, powerful, but generally peaceful, it flows through farmland and past market towns, under bridges built in every century of the last millennium. The salmon run these waters, as they have since the glaciers retreated, driven by instincts older than human memory, fighting upstream to spawn in the same gravels where they themselves were born. Fishermen have taken them with nets and spears and rods, fed themselves and their families on the silver bodies, given thanks for the river's generosity. The Wye, most beautiful of Welsh rivers, joins the Severn near Chepstow, bringing its own cargo of mountain water and accumulated memories. The Wye rises in the same massif as the Severn, but chooses a different path, carving through the wooded gorges that painters and poets have celebrated for centuries. Below Hay-on-Wye, where books are traded and rivers are admired, the Wye enters its most spectacular reach, flowing between cliffs draped in ancient woodland, the trees leaning out over the water as if trying to see their own reflections. At Simmons' Yacht, the Wye loops through a landscape of limestone cliffs and oak forests, peregrine falcons nesting on the rock faces, kingfishers darting along the water's surface like streaks of blue flame. Canoeists drift through these reaches in summer, their paddles barely disturbing the surface, their voices echoing off the rock walls. But in winter, when the rains come and the river rises, the Wye becomes something else entirely, a muscular torrent that carries entire trees downstream, that floods the low meadows and reminds the valley dwellers that beauty and power are often the same thing. Tintern Abbey stands beside the Wye, its roof open to the sky for 5 centuries now, its Gothic arches framing the trees and clouds beyond. Monks built this place to the glory of God, and chose a site beside the river because water meant life, power, transport, sustenance. They fished the Wye, powered their mills with its current, traveled its length to markets and monasteries downstream. When Henry's commissioners came to dissolve the monasteries, the Wye flowed on unchanged, outlasting empires, as rivers do. The Trent rises in Staffordshire, gathering itself from springs on Biddulph Moor, beginning its journey toward the North Sea with characteristic modesty. Through the potteries it flows, past the bottle kilns and factory towns where generations have shaped clay, pulled from the earth into vessels for tea and dinner, export and empire. The river here is working water, neither scenic nor celebrated, but essential nonetheless. It carried the coal that fired the kilns, floated the finished goods to market, diluted the industrial waste that turned its waters murky and lifeless for a century. But rivers recover when we let them. The Trent that flows through Nottingham today runs clearer than it has in 200 years. The fish returning, the birds returning, the otters returning to hunt along banks that once knew only effluent and indifference. This is the quiet miracle of water. Given time and reduced pressure, it cleanses itself, restores itself, remembers what it was before we bent it to our purposes. At Nottingham, the Trent passes beneath the castle rock where medieval kings dispensed justice and rebels plotted uprising. The river here is substantial, a major waterway that has been deepened and managed for navigation, locks and weirs controlling its flow, guiding it toward its junction with the River Ouse, and ultimately to the Humber estuary. Barges still work these waters, carrying cargo less romantic than in centuries past, but continuing the ancient tradition of river commerce that connects inland markets to the wider world. The Trent has known invasion and battle along its length. Vikings sailed up from the Humber, their long ships riding low in the water, their eyes scanning the banks for settlements to raid or trade with, depending on the season and their mood. Later, during the Civil War, control of the Trent crossings meant control of the Midlands, and armies maneuvered along its banks, bridges destroyed and rebuilt, ferries commandeered, fords contested. The water witnessed it all and flowed on, indifferent to the outcomes, faithful only to gravity and the distant sea. Now let us consider the Ouse, or rather the several ouzes that flow through England, for the name simply means water in an old tongue, and several rivers claimed it before anyone thought to distinguish them with cardinal directions. The great Ouse rises in Northamptonshire, flows through Bedford and Cambridge, carves through the fenlands toward the Wash. In its middle reaches, the river meanders extravagantly through water meadows and farmland, the engineers having long ago given up trying to straighten it, accepting its wandering nature as immutable. At Cambridge, the Ouse becomes the Cam, or the Cam becomes the Ouse, depending on which historical document you credit. Students punt along the backs in summer, gliding beneath bridges built when the colleges were new, when Newton walked these banks and Byron swam these waters. The willows trail their branches in the current, the same species of willow that grew here when the Romans built their fort on the hill, when Saxon farmers cleared the forests, when the first college was founded 700 years ago. Below Cambridge, the Ouse enters the fens, that strange flat landscape that is more water than land, where the horizon stretches unbroken to the limits of vision, where the sky dominates everything, and the quality of light changes hour by hour, in ways that lowland painters have tried to capture for generations. The fens were marshland once, before the Dutch engineers came to drain them, great watery wilderness where wildfowl gathered in uncountable numbers, and people lived on islands, traveling by boat, cutting peat for fuel, fishing and fowling for survival. The drainage changed everything, converting swamp to farmland, but the water never forgot. The fens still flood when the rivers rise, and the pumps cannot cope, the land remembering its watery past, returning briefly to its original state. The people here live with this reality, their homes built on slight elevations, their eyes always on the sky and the river levels, their history full of great floods when the defenses failed and the water reclaimed what was once its own. The Yorkshire Ouse forms at the meeting of the Swale and the Eure, two Pennine rivers that drain the high moors and dales of the north. By the time they join, each has traveled through some of England's most austere and beautiful landscape, flowing through valleys where stone walls climb impossible slopes, where scattered farmsteads shelter in the lee of hills, where the wind comes straight from the north and winter arrives early and stays late. Through York the Ouse flows, beneath the walls of that ancient city that has known Roman governors, Viking kings, Norman archbishops, the rise and fall of empires. The minster towers over the river, its Gothic magnificence reflected in the water on still days, its bells carrying across the floodplain. The Ouse has been York's highway and its hazard, bringing trade and bringing floods, providing defense and providing access to invaders. The Romans chose this site because the river was fordable here, though barely, the gravel bottom firm enough for wagons and marching columns. That ford determined the location of the fortress, and the fortress became a city that has endured 2,000 years. Downstream from York, the Ouse broadens and slows, tidal influence beginning to make itself felt, the river becoming estuary, fresh water mixing with salt. At the junction with the Trent, the Humber proper begins, that great muddy waterway that drains a fifth of England, carrying the combined waters of the Pennines and the Midlands to the North Sea. The Humber is not celebrated for its beauty. It is wide and brown and industrial, lined with docks and factories, spanned by a bridge that seems almost impossibly long, its waters opaque with sediment stirred by tide and current. But the Humber is honest water, working water, essential water. It has carried the coal that powered the Industrial Revolution, the steel that built ships and railways and factories, the wool and grain and manufactured goods that made England wealthy. Fishermen still work its waters, though the catches are smaller than their grandfathers knew. Seals sometimes venture up on the tide, gray heads bobbing in the murky current, reminding us that even industrial waterways remain habitat, remain alive. The Medway rises in the Weald of Kent, where ancient forests once stood, where charcoal burners and iron smelters worked in the centuries before coal, where the last wild boar of England were hunted to extinction. Through orchards and hop gardens the young river flows, through countryside that seems impossibly pastoral, impossibly English. The apple blossoms in spring like snow on the branches, the hop poles standing in ordered ranks like silent armies. At Maidstone, the county town, the Medway becomes navigable, locks controlling its descent toward the Thames estuary. Through Rochester it flows beneath the castle and cathedral that face each other across the bridge. The Norman keeps standing watch as it has for 900 years, the cathedral bells marking the hours as they have done since Augustine brought Christianity to Kent. Dickens loved this town and this river, walked its streets, watched its waters, placed it in his novels as a character in its own right, recognizing that places have personalities, that rivers have stories to tell. The Medway estuary is a complicated landscape of mudflats and islands, channels and creeks where the tide runs swift and the unwary can be trapped. Historic dockyards line these reaches, where ships of the Royal Navy were built for centuries, where the timbers of English oak were shaped into vessels that carried the flag to every corner of the globe. The dockyards are quiet now, museums rather than shipyards, but the estuary remains busy with container ships and tankers, commerce continuing in forms the old shipwrights would barely recognize. Turning westward, let us follow the course of the Avon, though again we must specify which Avon we mean, for the name simply means river, and several claim it. The Bristol Avon rises in the Cotswolds, flows through Bath, carves the Avon Gorge at Bristol, reaches the Severn Estuary through one of England's most dramatic tidal reaches. At Bath, the river flows past Roman baths fed by hot springs, the only hot springs in Britain, where legionaries soaked their aching limbs and gave thanks to Sulis Minerva, goddess of the healing waters. The Georgians rebuilt Bath in golden stone, creating a city of elegant terraces and crescents that climbed the hills above the river, the architecture so perfect that it seems inevitable, as if it grew from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. The Avon flows beneath Pulteney Bridge, one of only 4 bridges in the world, lined with shops on both sides, the river almost hidden. Beneath the buildings, its presence marked more by sound than sight, the constant voice of flowing water, a background murmur to the commerce above. At Bristol, the Avon performs its final miracle, cutting through the limestone plateau in a gorge so deep and narrow that early travelers could scarcely believe it natural. The Clifton Suspension Bridge spans this chasm, Brunel's masterpiece, its chains anchored in living rock, its roadway suspended above the water like a promise of human ingenuity. Below, the river runs tidal and turbulent, the water rising and falling 20 feet or more with each tide, the current fierce enough to have defeated engineers for centuries. The tide brings the Severn Estuary up the Avon, salt water mixing with fresh, creating a unique habitat where fresh and marine species meet and mingle. Salmon and sea trout run this gauntlet, fighting the tide to reach their spawning grounds upstream, their determination. Absolute, their success rate improved now that the pollution of industrial centuries has been reduced, the water cleaner, the oxygen levels higher, life returning. The Dart rises on Dartmoor, that granite fastness in the heart of Devon, where ponies roam free, and ancient tors crown the hilltops like the remains of giant castles. 2 branches of the Dart begin separately, the East Dart and West Dart, each gathering water from the high moor flowing through landscapes of gorse and heather past stone circles and burial cairns left by people who knew this land before the forests were cleared, before the moor was open, as it is now. The 2 branches unite near Dartmeet, becoming a single river that carves through oak woodland, the trees leaning over the water, their roots gripping, the rocky banks, their canopy creating a tunnel of green through which the river flows in dappled shadow. This is some of the last ancient woodland in southern England, these oak trees descendants of the wild wood that covered Britain after the ice retreated, their genetics unchanged, their presence a living link to the prehistoric past. At Totnes, the highest navigable point, the Dart becomes tidal, the sea's influence reaching inland, the river widening, the banks giving way to mudflats at low tide. The town is old beyond memory, its castle Norman, its street planned Saxon or earlier, its setting on the river, no accident. Rivers were highways before roads existed, the natural routes for trade and invasion, settlement and expansion. Every significant town in England stands on a river or the coast, water being the key to everything. The Dart estuary is deep and beautiful, wooded hills rising steeply from the water's edge, the river broad enough for naval vessels that once anchored here, the currents strong enough that sailing these waters requires skill and local knowledge. At Dartmouth, the river meets the sea properly. Guardhouses on either bank, once able to stretch a chain between them, closing the river to unwanted vessels, protecting the anchorage within. The Crusaders sailed from here, medieval ships bound for the Holy Land, their fate largely failure, but their faith absolute. The Tamar marks the border between Devon and Cornwall for much of its length, flowing from sources near the north coast southward to the English Channel, creating a natural boundary that has defined counties and kingdoms for 1,000 years. Cornwall is different. The people will tell you, not quite England, Celtic in heritage and temperament, its own duchy with its own traditions. The Tamar makes this difference visible, a line of water that defines identity. The river flows through steep-sided valleys where mining once dominated the economy, the hillsides scarred with engine houses and spoil heaps, the evidence of centuries of extraction when Cornwall's copper and tin fed the Industrial Revolution. The mines are closed now, the engine houses maintained as monuments, the valleys quieter than they have been in 2 centuries. The Tamar flows cleaner, too, the contamination of mining giving way slowly to recovery, nature proving once again its capacity to heal when pressure is released. Near Plymouth, the Tamar becomes the Hamaas, a complex waterway where river meets sea, where naval dockyards have served the fleet for centuries, where submarines and warships still maintain a presence. The Tamar Bridge and Brunel's Royal Albert Bridge span the river here, linking Cornwall to Devon, joining what the river separates. From the bridge, at high tide, the water stretches broad and calm, deceptively peaceful, hiding the fierce currents that run beneath. The Eshe rises on Exmoor, that northern equivalent of Dartmoor, another upland landscape of moorland and coastal cliffs where red deer are more common than people. The river flows southward through Devon, past Tiverton where wool merchants built fortunes in medieval times, through Exeter where Romans built a fortress, and Saxons built a cathedral, and the Luftwaffe dropped bombs during the war that destroyed much of the medieval city, but somehow spared the cathedral, its twin towers still dominating the skyline. Below Exeter, the Eshe opens into a broad estuary, mudflats and sandbanks creating a complex landscape that shifts with every tide, channels moving, banks appearing and disappearing, the water finding new routes and abandoning old ones. This is wading bird paradise, the mudflats rich with invertebrates, the birds gathering in thousands during migration seasons and winter months, their calls filling the air, their numbers testament to the productivity of estuary ecosystems. The estuary has been shaped by human hands as well as natural forces. The Exeter Ship Canal, cut in the 16th century, was England's first pound-lock canal, an engineering marvel of its time, allowing vessels to bypass the weirs and shallows of the natural river, bringing trade directly to Exeter's quays. The canal is still navigable, though now leisure craft dominate where merchant ships once jostled for position. The Thames, which we left at Oxford, flows on through Reading and Windsor, past Hampton Court where Henry VIII held court and hunted deer in the great park that still borders the river. The Thames here is London's river, though London is still miles downstream, the water flowing through increasingly urban landscapes, the banks increasingly managed, the natural character of the river constrained by centuries of engineering. At Richmond, the tidal Thames begins properly, the river rising and falling with the rhythm of the sea, though the tide is held back by barriers that protect London from storm surges. The Thames Barrier, completed in 1982, is one of the world's largest movable flood barriers, its curved gates lying flat on the river bottom until needed when they rotate upward to create a steel wall against the North Sea's fury. Climate change makes the barrier more necessary each decade, sea levels rising, storm intensity increasing, the river that gave London life becoming a threat that must be managed with ever more sophisticated technology. Through London the Thames flows beneath Tower Bridge and past the tower where history darkens the stones, where queens and traders and reformers lost their heads, where the crown jewels sleep behind thick walls and ancient ceremonies continue in modern times. The river here is working water still, though the docks that made London wealthy have moved downstream or closed entirely. The warehouses converted to apartments, the wharves to restaurants and parks. The Pool of London, once crowded with vessels from every corner of the empire, vessels bringing tea and spices and silk, vessels carrying wool and coal and manufactured goods, now sees mostly tour boats and water taxis. The commerce moved to container ports in the estuary, where cranes load and unload ships too large to venture upstream. But the river remains essential, remains London's defining feature, the feature that made London possible in the first place. Past Greenwich, the Thames widens, becoming estuary more than river, the water brackish and increasingly salty, the landscape flat and dominated by sky. Here are the industries that require river access and deep water, oil refineries and power stations, cement works and container terminals, the unglamorous but essential infrastructure that keeps a modern nation functioning. The river, which began as a spring in a Cotswold meadow, ends in the North Sea, its fresh water mixing with the ocean, its journey complete yet also eternal, for the water evaporates and falls as rain and flows again, the cycle unbroken since the world was young. The Mersey begins where the Goyt and Tame unite, two Pennine streams joining forces to create a river that will carve through the heart of industrial northern England. Through Stockport the young Mersey flows, gathering volume and purpose, heading toward its appointment with history at Liverpool. The Mersey is not scenic in the conventional sense. It is an industrial river, a working river, its banks lined with factories and warehouses, its waters darkened by centuries of effluent, though cleaner now than in living memory. At Manchester, the Mersey becomes part of the ship canal system, an extraordinary feat of Victorian engineering that brought ocean-going vessels 35 miles inland, making Manchester a port despite being nowhere near the sea. The canal cost lives and fortunes to build, required the excavation of millions of tons of earth, the construction of locks and basins and wharves on a scale previously unattempted. But it worked, and for decades Manchester cotton traveled the canal to the world. While raw cotton traveled the canal inland, the Industrial Revolution made manifest in moving water. Liverpool, where the Mersey meets the Irish Sea, is River City made monument to commerce and migration. From these docks, emigrants sailed to America and Australia, leaving poverty and seeking fortune, their hopes and fears carried on vessels bound for distant ports. The Cunard Building and the Liver Building stand sentinel over the waterfront, reminders of when Liverpool was second only to London in Britain's commercial hierarchy, when the Mersey was one of the world's busiest waterways. The river has witnessed darker history, too. Liverpool grew rich on triangular trade, manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, cotton and sugar and tobacco back to Liverpool. This wealth built the grand buildings of the waterfront, funded the merchants' mansions, shaped the city that exists today. The Mersey carried vessels on all three legs of this trade. The water witnessed evil on an industrial scale. The reckoning with this history continues, the acknowledgment slow but necessary, the understanding growing that prosperity built on suffering carries obligations to remember and make amends. Northward now to the Tyne, rising in the Pennines like so many English rivers, gathering itself from burns and becks on the high moors where sheep outnumber people, and the wind never stops. The North Tyne and South Tyne flow separately through landscapes of remarkable emptiness, these northern uplands depopulated by enclosure and industrialization, the small farms abandoned, the walls falling to ruin, the land returning to rough grazing and moorland. At Hexham the Tynes unite and flow eastward toward Newcastle, that city built on coal and shipbuilding, where the Roman wall crosses the river, where medieval merchants built fortunes on wool, where the Industrial Revolution created wealth and misery in equal measure. The Tyne bridges are famous, each from a different era. The high-level bridge, rail, and road, together Victorian engineering at its most confident. The swing bridge still rotating to let vessels through. The Tyne Bridge Art Deco magnificence that resembles Sydney Harbour Bridge, because the same company designed both. The shipyards of the Tyne built vessels that sailed the world, merchant ships and warships, oil tankers, and passenger liners. The Swan Hunter and Vickers Armstrong yards employing thousands, their rivets hammering day and night, their steel plates shaped and welded their launches occasions of civic pride. The yards are mostly quiet now. The industry moved to countries with cheaper labor, the skills of generations no longer in demand. But the river remains, and new industries replace old. The cycle of economic change as constant as the flow of water. The Tyne estuary is industrial and magnificent simultaneously. The river mouth guarded by piers that make a safe harbor. The fishing fleet still operating, though diminished. The North Sea fierce and unforgiving beyond the shelter of the piers. Tynemouth Priory ruins stand on the headland. The monastery dissolved and dismantled centuries ago. The stone walls softened by weather and time. The site offering views across the river mouth and the ocean beyond. The Wear, the Tyne's southern neighbor, flows through Dereham, where the cathedral and castle crown a near island of rock around which the river loops dramatically. The cathedral is Norman, massive and austere, built to impress and intimidate, to demonstrate the power of the church and the permanence of the conquest. The Venerable Bede's remains rest here. England's first historian, the monk who wrote our earliest historical records, who documented a world of kingdoms and conversions, migrations, and miracles. Below Dereham, the Wear flows through a landscape transformed by coal mining, the collieries that once dominated employment now closed, the pit villages struggling to find new purposes, new economies. The slag heaps are being landscaped, the mine shafts capped, nature reclaiming what industry disturbed. But the culture of the mining communities persists, the solidarity forged underground, the brass bands and working men's clubs, the collective memory of hard work and harder struggles. At Sunderland, the Wear meets the sea, the river mouth lined with the remnants of shipbuilding, another northern industry largely departed. The Wearmouth Bridge spans the river, its arch elegant and functional, designed in an age when civil engineering was public art, when bridges were built to last centuries and beautify cities simultaneously. The estuary is quieter than it once was, but seals have returned, fishing in the river mouth, reminding us that even industrial waterways remain habitat, remain part of the natural world. The Tees rises on Crossfell, highest point of the Pennines, where the wind is fierce and the temperature rarely warm, where snow can fall in any month, and the views extend to Scotland on clear days. The Infant Tees is a mountain stream, tumbling over waterfalls, cutting through limestone and basalt, creating landscapes of austere beauty. High Force, England's largest waterfall, sends the young Tees plunging over a dolerite cliff, the water thundering into the plunge pool below, spray rising like mist, the sound audible for miles. Through Teesdale the river flows, past farmsteads and through hay meadows that have been cut for centuries, the hay feeding cattle through the long northern winters. This is landscape little changed in its essentials, the pattern of fields and walls and scattered farms maintaining continuity with the past, the rural economy still functioning though much diminished. The people here are as tough as the landscape, shaped by the weather and the isolation, independent and self-reliant by necessity. At Stockton and Middlesbrough, the Tees becomes completely different. An industrial river carrying chemicals and steel, refineries and processing plants lining its banks, the air sharp with industrial smells, the water no longer clear. This is the price of prosperity, or was the assumption that rivers could absorb infinite abuse, that nature existed to be exploited. We know better now, or claim to, though the cleanup proceeds slowly, the contamination of generations not easily remedied. The Tees estuary is a landscape of dunes and mudflats, nature persisting despite industry, migratory birds gathering on the mudflats, seals hunting in the channels. The river enters the North Sea here, completing its journey from mountain spring to ocean, from clarity to complexity, carrying the stories of all it has seen and known. Smaller rivers deserve their moment in this chronicle as well, for not all waterways need be mighty to be meaningful. The Test rises in Hampshire, flowing through chalk downlands, emerging spring-fed and crystal clear, cold even in summer, its gravels perfect for trout spawning. The Test is perhaps England's most famous trout stream, its waters fished by anglers willing to pay extraordinary sums for the privilege of casting a fly over these educated fish. The water clarity of chalk streams is remarkable, the river bottom visible, even in the deepest pools, the water plants swaying in the current, the trout holding in the current, like shadows, rising occasionally to take insects from the surface. The Test has been managed for fishing for centuries, the river keepers maintaining the banks, controlling the weed growth, releasing fish to supplement natural spawning, creating an artificial Eden that serves human recreation but maintains genuine ecological value. The Itchen, the Test's neighbor, is equally beautiful, flowing through Winchester where Saxon kings held court, where the cathedral holds the remains of Jane Austen, where the river has been managed and cherished since Roman times. These chalk streams are England's equivalent of coral reefs, globally rare habitats that support specialized species found nowhere else, their cold, clear water and constant flow creating conditions that most rivers cannot match. The Kennet rises in Wiltshire, flows through Marlborough and Newbury, joins the Thames at Reading. Along its banks stand the monuments of prehistory, Silbury Hill, largest prehistoric mound in Europe, built for purposes we can only guess. Avebury Stone Circle, older than Stonehenge, its massive stones arranged in patterns that surely meant something profound to the builders. The river witnessed the construction of these monuments, if witness is the right word for water's passive presence, flowing past the work of generations outlasting the civilization that shaped these stones. The Kennet and Avon Canal uses the Kennet Valley for part of its route, linking London to Bristol, a waterway built in the age when canals were the future, before railways made them obsolete almost before they were completed. The canal is maintained now for pleasure boats, the locks operated by volunteers, the towpath walked by. Locals and tourists, the water moving slowly as canal water always does, patient and persistent, connecting landscapes and communities in ways roads never quite manage. The Stour flows through Suffolk and Essex, forming much of the border between them, flowing through Constable country, so called, because John Constable painted these scenes, made Flatford Mill and Dedham. Vale famous captured the quality of light and water and English landscape that somehow epitomizes a particular kind of rural ideal. The paintings are famous. The landscape remains, changed, certainly, but recognizable, the river still reflecting the willows, the meadows still flooding in winter. The Stour is a gentle river, seldom dramatic, never dangerous under normal conditions, but essential nonetheless to the landscape it drains and defines. The water-powered mills for centuries, grinding corn that fed the region, fulling cloth that built fortunes in the wool trade. The mills are museums now, or houses or rooms. Their water wheels still are removed, but the river flows on, indifferent to the economic transformations that rise and fall along its banks. The Norfolk Broads are rivers too, though they seem more like lakes, these expansions of the Bure and Yare and Waveney into landscapes of open water, and reed beds created inadvertently by medieval peat, cutting the old diggings flooded to create England's largest protected wetland. The Broads are habitat for rare birds and insects, are highways for pleasure boats, are reminders that human activity and natural beauty are not always opposed, that sometimes human disturbance creates new ecosystems that nature adapts to and fills with life. Through Norwich flows the Winsome, a tributary of the Yare, the city built where the river could be crossed and defended, where trade routes intersected, where Norwich became for a time one of England's largest and wealthiest cities. The cathedral dominates the old city, its spire visible for miles across the flat Norfolk landscape, its cloisters holding stories of bishops and builders, of medieval prosperity and modern survival. The Eden rises in the Pennines and flows through Cumbria to the Solway Firth, through landscapes of remarkable beauty, past Penrith and through Carlisle, marking the ancient border between England and Scotland, a frontier region where allegiances shifted and raids were common and peace was always temporary. The Eden Valley is pastoral now, the conflicts centuries past, but the landscape remembers in its tower houses and fortified farms the architecture of insecurity. At Carlisle, the Eden passes beneath walls that have seen siege and storm, where the Romans built a fortress at the western end of Hadrian's Wall, where medieval kings built castles to control the border, where the last battle on English soil was fought in 1745, when Bonnie Prince Charlie, as Jacobite army, briefly held the city before retreating north. The river witnessed all this and flowed on, outlasting armies and empires, kingdoms and causes. The Derwent flows through the Lake District, draining Derwentwater before flowing through Cockermouth, where Wordsworth was born, where the poet learned to love the landscapes he would later immortalize in verse. The Lake District is mountain and water, rock and reflection. The lakes carved by glaciers and filled by rivers that rise on the high fells where the rain falls heavy and often, where the clouds catch on the peaks and empty themselves in storms that feed the rivers and refill the lakes in perpetual cycle. The Ribble rises in the Yorkshire dales and flows through Lancashire to the Irish Sea, through Preston, where the river becomes tidal, where the estuary opens into mudflats and marshes, habitat for wildfowl, barrier to armies that once needed to control the river crossings. The Ribble estuary is unsung and beautiful. the kind of landscape that rewards those who look carefully, who learn to read the patterns of water and sand, who understand that beauty is not always dramatic or obvious. The Lune flows through Lancaster, giving the city its name, the river once navigable to the sea, bringing trade and prosperity, the Georgian merchants building their fortunes, and their elegant townhouses on profits from trade in slaves and sugar, textiles, and timber. Lancaster Castle dominates the river crossing, Norman strength built on Roman foundations, a courthouse, and prison for centuries, where the Pendle witches were tried and condemned, where justice was administered with the severity of the age. Below Lancaster the Lune widens, becomes estuary, flows past, more calm, where Victorians built a resort town to capture the trade of industrial workers seeking sea, air, and escape. The bay is treacherous, its tides among the fastest in Britain, its quicksands legendary, its history dark with drownings of cockle-pickers and Chinese workers exploited and abandoned. The Lune enters this bay carrying mountain water to the sea, completing its journey, joining the Irish Sea's tides and currents. As night deepens and our journey through England's waterways draws toward its own conclusion, we find ourselves returning always to certain truths about rivers, about water, about the relationship between landscape and the channels that drain it. Rivers are patient beyond human comprehension, their timescales measured in geological ages, their courses adjusted over millennia by the slow work of erosion and deposition. What seems permanent to us the river knows as temporary, the banks that constrain it, the bridges that cross it, the cities that crowd its shores. Rivers connect upland to lowland, mountain to sea, linking ecosystems and landscapes in chains of consequence. What happens in the headwaters affecting the estuary, pollution upstream appearing downstream, rain on the high moors determining flood risk in the valley towns. We cannot separate ourselves from rivers, cannot claim to be apart from the systems they represent and maintain. We drink them, swim in them, build beside them, depend upon them in ways so fundamental we forget to notice. The water flowing from our taps, traveling from reservoirs filled by rivers, by rain, by the same cycle that has operated since the oceans formed. Rivers have powered our mills and carried our commerce, have defended our borders and defined our counties, have inspired our poets and challenged our engineers. They have been highways and barriers, resources and hazards, the defining features of landscape that determined where cities arose and how history unfolded. Rome built its empire along rivers. The Vikings traveled them. Medieval merchants moved goods along them. Industrial Revolution manufacturers sited factories on them for power and transport. But rivers are not merely human tools, not simply resources for exploitation. They are ecosystems of astonishing complexity, habitat for fish and insects, amphibians and mammals, birds and plants, each species adapted to particular conditions of flow and temperature, depth, and substrate. The mayfly that lives one day as an adult may have spent 2 years as a nymph in the riverbed gravel. The salmon that returns to spawn may have traveled 8,000 miles through ocean. It finds its birth stream by taste and instinct, memory written in genes, guidance given by forces we barely understand. The otter, once hunted to near extinction in England, has returned to most rivers now, proof that protection works. That species can recover when we cease persecuting them and clean the waters they depend upon. To see an otter in a river is to witness wildness persisting, adaptation succeeding. the natural world maintaining its presence despite our impacts. The otter slides into the water at dusk, barely a ripple, hunts the pools and shallows, emerges with a fish, returns to its holt before dawn. Kingfishers, those flashes of iridescent blue and orange, hunt from overhanging branches, diving after minnows and sticklebacks, their colors improbable and magnificent. That such birds exist, that they persist along rivers within sight of cities, is daily miracle we too seldom notice. The kingfisher requires clean water, requires fish, requires banks to nest in. Where kingfishers thrive, the river is healthy, the ecosystem functioning. Herons stand like gray sentinels in the shallows, waiting with patience that would shame monks, their stillness absolute until the moment of striking, the lightning thrust of the beak, the fish caught and swallowed, the wait resuming. Herons have hunted English rivers since before humans arrived, their fishing technique perfected across millions of years of evolution, their success rate high enough to support their survival, their presence a continuity with the deep past. The plants of rivers are as specialized as the animals. Water crowfoot waves in the current, its white flowers appearing in spring, its roots anchored in gravel, its stems flexible enough to survive flood, strong enough to resist the constant flow. Reed beds fringe the slower reaches, the tall stems rustling in the wind. Habitat for reed warblers and water voles, the density of growth providing cover and nesting sites, the root systems stabilizing banks and filtering nutrients. Rivers change with the seasons in ways both obvious and subtle. Spring brings snowmelt from the high grounds, the rivers running full and fast, the banks overtopped, the floodplains living up to their name. Summer sees flows decrease, the rivers shrinking to their main channels, pools becoming isolated, the water warming, fish seeking the cooler, more oxygenated water of riffles and rapids. Autumn brings the spawning runs, salmon and sea trout fighting upstream, their bodies battered by the journey, their determination absolute, their fate after spawning often death, the river taking back what it gave. Winter transforms rivers again, ice sometimes forming at the margins, the water coldest now, its flow sluggish in protected bends, swift in the main current. Snow on the high ground waits to melt, storage for the spring flood, guarantee of summer flow. The river in winter is quieter, fewer insects hatching, fewer birds calling, the landscape dormant but not dead, waiting for the turn of the year, the lengthening days, the return of warmth and growth. Human history along rivers is written in bridges and mills, locks and weirs, docks and warehouses, all the infrastructure we have built to harness and manage and cross these waterways. Some of this infrastructure is centuries old, stone bridges built by medieval masons still carrying traffic, their arches mathematical and beautiful, their foundations sunk to bedrock, their construction quality evident in their survival. Modern bridges cross on pillars of concrete and steel, their spans longer, their capacities greater, but somehow less satisfying aesthetically, function privileged over form. Mills occupy a special place in river history, the harnessing of flowing water to grind grain being one of humanity's crucial technological achievements, liberating us from the limitations of human and animal muscle. The Doomsday Book records thousands of mills in England, nearly every village having one, the miller being a person of importance and often wealth, controlling as he did the means to convert grain to flour. Most mills are silent now, their water wheels stilled or removed, the buildings converted to houses or museums, But the races remain, the channels that directed water to the wheel, still visible, still shaping the riverbank landscape. Locks and weirs made rivers navigable, creating stepped waterways where boats could travel upstream and down, the locks acting as water elevators, raising and lowering vessels to overcome changes in elevation. The canal age saw this technology perfected narrow locks economical, with water designed for the narrow boats that are now leisure craft, but were once working vessels carrying coal and goods traveling the network of canals that briefly seemed the future of transport before railways made them obsolete. The Thames has seen its lock system maintained and improved for centuries, keeping the river navigable far upstream, allowing pleasure craft to travel from London to Oxford and beyond. The locks managed by keepers who operate the gates and collect the fees, who maintain continuity with centuries of lock keeping. To watch a boat rise in a lock is to witness water being made to work, gravity and fluid dynamics combining in simple but effective engineering. Floods are rivers asserting their ancient rights, reclaiming the floodplains that we have built upon in forgetfulness or defiance of natural patterns. When winter rains are heavy and sustained, when snow melts rapidly in the uplands, rivers rise and spread, finding again the channels they occupied in previous floods, the water knowing the way, following contours we had forgotten existed. Houses flood, roads close, communities isolate, the costs measured in millions, the damage real and distressing. Yet floods are natural events essential to river ecology, depositing nutrients on floodplains, scouring channels, maintaining the dynamism that rivers require. Our efforts to prevent all flooding through ever higher defenses may protect specific locations, but transfer the problem downstream. The water that cannot spread must flow faster and deeper, the flood peak sharper. Perhaps wisdom lies in accepting that some places should flood, in building accordingly, in maintaining floodplains as floodplains rather than development land. Climate change is altering river patterns in ways we are only beginning to understand. Wetter winters and drier summers seem likely, the river flows more extreme, droughts more severe, floods more frequent. Rivers that have flowed continuously for thousands of years may become seasonal, their upper reaches drying in summer, their ecosystems stressed beyond adaptation. Or winter flooding may increase beyond our infrastructure's capacity to manage, the defenses overtopped, the damage escalating. The relationship between humans and rivers has always been complicated, mixing dependence and fear, utility and worship. Ancient peoples made offerings to rivers, cast treasures into the water, recognized in the flow something worthy of reverence. The Romans personified rivers as gods, built shrines at their sources, gave thanks for safe crossings. Something of this awareness survives in our language, in the way we speak of rivers as alive, as having moods and memories, as being subjects rather than mere objects. Rivers have carried our dead as well as our living, burial by water being a way of returning the body to the elements, of acknowledging the flow of life toward the sea. The Ganges is most famous for this practice, but English rivers have known it too, cremated ashes scattered on the water, the current carrying them downstream and away, dispersing what was concentrated, returning what was borrowed back to the world. The future of England's rivers depends on choices we make now about climate, about pollution, about development and protection. Will we continue to straighten and channelize, to treat rivers as drains and barriers? Or will we return some rivers to natural courses, remove some weirs and dams, Create space for flooding. Recognize that river health and human well-being are connected, not opposed. Some rivers are being restored, their channels allowed to meander again, their floodplains protected, their water quality improved. The Thames is cleaner than it has been in 2 centuries, salmon returning, seals swimming as far upstream as Richmond. The Tyne sees fish where only pollution existed 50 years ago. These are signs of hope, evidence that restoration is possible, that rivers recover when we reduce our impacts. But threats remain. Agricultural runoff carries nutrients that cause algal blooms. Microplastics pervade even remote headwaters. Abstraction for drinking water and irrigation reduces flows. Climate change alters precipitation patterns. Rivers need clean water in sufficient quantity, flowing at appropriate times of year, carrying sediment and nutrients in natural rhythms. Maintaining these conditions requires effort and investment, regulation and enforcement, willingness to prioritize river health over short-term convenience. As you drift toward sleep, let your mind follow one last river, any river, from its source to the sea. Begin in the high country, where water first emerges from the ground, cold and clear, tasting of the rock it flowed through, the beginning of everything that follows. Feel the first trickle over stones, the gathering of drops into flow, the inevitable pull downward toward the sea that waits patient and eternal. Follow the river through its youth, through rapids and waterfalls, through pools where trout hold in the current, through channels carved in bedrock and valleys filled with forest. See the tributaries joining, each adding its volume and character, the river growing, deepening, slowing. Pass through the places where humans have built, the bridges and towns, the mills and locks, the evidence of our long engagement with these waters. Continue downstream through the lowlands, where the river broadens and meanders, where herons hunt and kingfishers flash, where willows trail their branches and water plants wave in the current. See the landscape shaped by water, the fertile floodplains, the oxbow lakes, the terraces marking ancient flood levels, the whole topography, a record of the river's work across millennia. Follow the river to the estuary, where fresh water meets salt, where the tide pulses up and down, where mudflats emerge at low water and vanish at high, where birds gather in thousands, where the river finally releases its burden of mountain water to the ocean. Watch the water mix and merge, the boundary between river and sea dissolving, the distinction becoming meaningless. All water ultimately one water, cycling endlessly through ocean and cloud, rain and river, evaporation and condensation, the great circle unbroken. And now let the river carry you. Let yourself float on its surface or drift beneath it, surrendering to the current, allowing the flow to take you where it will. There is no need to swim or steer, no need to resist or control. The river knows the way, has known it always, will know it forever. Trust the water, trust the flow, trust the ancient path from source to sea. The river murmurs its eternal song, the sound of moving water that has lulled countless generations to sleep, that will continue long after our brief moment has passed. Let that sound fill your awareness, the gentle rushing, the quiet gurgling, the subtle variations of flow over stone and sand. Around bends and through shallows, the voice of water speaking in tongues older than language, saying nothing and everything simultaneously. Sleep now, drift now, carried by waters that remember everything and forget nothing, that flow through darkness and light, through history and prehistory, through all that has been and all that will be. The rivers of old England flow on in their timeless courses, and you flow with them, part of the water, part of the world, part of the endless cycle of return and renewal. The water remembers. The water flows. The water carries you gently, safely, inevitably, toward rest, toward peace, toward the deep quiet where all rivers end and begin again. Let go now. Float now. Sleep comes on the current, arrives with the tide, settles like mist over the water meadows. The rivers flow in darkness as they flow in light, their constancy absolute, their presence eternal. And in the flowing and the endless patient movement of water toward the sea, there is rest, there is peace, there is the ancient rhythm that predates thought and will outlast memory. Listen to it now, the river's voice, calling you deeper, calling you down, calling you home to sleep and dreams, in the quiet country where rivers begin. The rivers flow. They have always flowed. They will always flow. And in their flowing, they carry you softly into sleep, into darkness, into the deep waters where consciousness dissolves and rest begins. Sleep now. The rivers are here. The rivers remember. The rivers carry you safely through the night toward morning.